to the city of light. Where my heart can beat with the nightlife. Where are we going?
All right, good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be returning to these in-person opportunities and these hybrid opportunities so there can be more participation, whatever works best for you. So my name is Shelley Karuna, and I worked with the HIV Vaccine Trials Network as a physician scientist there for about 15 years. I have moved to lead vaccine and therapeutics development with a small public benefit biotech in the last year, but I continue to stay engaged with HIV vaccine and cure and prevention approaches, primarily through the ATIs that I'll talk with you about in the next few minutes.
I'm sorry, I haven't queued up your slides properly
for
the screen share.
Oh, okay.
My apologies.
No worries. So as he's doing that, I'll just say that one of the things that really struck me about Liz's presentation and has really moved me about this work more broadly in the last 5 to 10 years or so is exactly the observation that's reflected in her data, that the vast majority of HIV cure research is centered in the United States. And we talked a little bit about why that may be. I think that some of those reasons will be reflected and hopefully debunked in the next half hour and beyond as I talk about our work. Oh, thank you. Thanks. As I talk about our work to expand this opportunity, really, and the tremendous amount that we can learn from countries outside of the United States and communities outside of the United States. So let's see. How do I? Yeah. It doesn't seem to be the right arrow key, right? Oh yeah, okay. I just need to press it harder. Thank you. So in summary, the main questions that I will explore today are, can ATIs be conducted safely in Africa? And can they help us address some key questions, not only in cure, but also in prevention and treatment? The punchline from the very beginning is that yes, of course, they can be conducted safely and very well in Africa. And in fact, African women in particular are a unique population from whom and with whom we can learn, excuse me, a great deal. And from whom and with whom we can learn unique things that cannot be learned from exclusively limiting HIV cure and ATI trials to the United States. It's important for cure research because I think we do need to broaden those horizons geographically and demographically. And we can learn through these particular studies, I think, unique lessons about both the immune responses in the host, the person living with HIV, and characteristics of the virus through these studies. And hopefully that knowledge will help us more efficiently identify effective curative strategies. So briefly, in the next half hour or so, I'll start with brief background on ATIs in Africa and on the AMP studies, which were the parent studies, if you will, for the analytical treatment interruptions that I'll then dive into for most of the time. I do want to acknowledge that although most of the time I'll be talking to you about an ATI in Africa, I am not African. I do not live in Africa. And so really, I am a voice today for especially all of these individuals listed here, who are my colleagues and dear friends and mentors in many ways in Africa, throughout sub-Saharan Africa specifically, where this trial is ongoing. So you all know better than most other groups I have the pleasure of speaking with what an ATI is. But specifically with respect to what we'll talk about today, I'm going to be talking about an ATI that looks at an intervention before ART ever began. So those interventions can include early initiation of ART itself, or they can include another tool like a broadly neutralizing antibody or maybe a vaccine that is received by the participant before they ever, in some cases, even know that they've acquired HIV, and at least before they begin suppressive antiretroviral treatment. Of course, we can also do interventions after someone has been on ART for some time before they interrupt their ART, or after they've been on ART for some time right after they interrupt their ART. So lots of different time points and ways of conducting an analytical treatment interruption. There actually have been many treatment interruptions in Africa over the years. From the very beginning, when they were more typically referred to as structured treatment interruptions or STIs, all the way through today. So lest we think that the one that I'm going to spend most of the time on today is novel or never been seen in Africa before, it really has. These ATIs or STIs asked a range of questions. You know, earlier on, those questions were more about how can we reduce toxicity or address resistance. But now the questions are more about how can we find tools that can enable people to experience ART-free virologic suppression. I'm going to talk briefly about one of these in particular because it's important to set the stage and understand the way that we designed the AMP ATI in Africa. So the SPARTAC study was an evaluation in the early part of this century, asking primarily whether short-term ART initiated early in HIV infection could ultimately allow someone to live with HIV without ART for longer. Now, remember that this was conducted at a time when the indication to begin ART was a CD4 T cell count of around 350. Different parts of the world at different times had different indications. But in general, in the population that was evaluated in this study, people would ordinarily learn that they have HIV. They would be followed for CD4 T cell counts and in some cases viral load. And once that CD4 T cell count got to 350 or lower, they would start ART. So this study took people and had one group of standard care, exactly what I just described, watching and waiting to see if their CD4 T cell count would get to 350, and if and when it did, starting ART. Another group started ART immediately, stayed on it for 12 weeks, and then went off it and was followed according to the standard of care. And another group started ART immediately, took it for 48 weeks, took it for about a year, and then went off and was followed until they reached that CD4 T cell criterion.
So when you click the X on the Zoom,
Oh, yeah. Okay, great. All right. So a study took these individuals that were participating in the SPARTAC study, and they did, okay, now I'm back to, let's see, having some trouble advancing the slides. There we go. Okay. So a sub-study looked only at SPARTAC participants from Africa. These were all female, all from Uganda and South Africa, and all had acquired non-B, mostly clade C, HIV. They looked at these individuals to see how long those individuals in the 1 year of early ART arm were able to go before they met that low CD4 T cell count criterion to restart ART. So these individuals had essentially been in an ATI, right? They had been diagnosed with HIV, they got 48 weeks of ART, and then that ART was interrupted. So they're in the midst of an ATI. These are 22 African women. And what they found is that nearly 1/4 of those women went for over 3.5 years before they ever met criteria, even virologic criteria, to start ART. They maintained a viral load below 400 for 3.5 years after once they went into that ATI. The only intervention these women had was early ART initiation and 1 year, 48 weeks of ART. So this is quite unique. This is a high rate, 23% of these African women who maintained ART-free virologic suppression as defined by viral load less than 400 copies per mil for nearly 4 years, actually. All right. That brings us to, so I'm going to ask you to set that aside for just a moment, and let's take just a few minutes to talk about the AMP studies, which are the parent studies of the ATI I'll talk to you about. So this study looked at a neutralizing antibody. In this image on the left, we have this purple HIV virion, and we have the kind of lavender things that look like trees that are the spike GP120 envelope protein on the virion. We also have these circulating slightly Y-shaped green antibodies, and these are neutralizing antibodies that will bind to that spike protein, the purple tree-like figure, and neutralize, in this representation, drain all the color from the HIV virion. So they bind to those proteins, they prevent those proteins from binding to and infecting other cells, essentially stopping infection. In the AMP studies, we looked at one particular antibody, VRC01, reflected here in the purple and the green, and we looked at that in 2 parallel harmonized clinical trials. One was conducted in the Americas and Europe among MSM and trans individuals, largely in a clade B dominated environment. And then the sister trial was conducted in sub-Saharan Africa, and the countries listed here, among women, largely exposed to clade C, but there were other clades circulating as well. And you can see that individuals would either receive, you can see my pointer here, a lower dose of the antibody, a higher dose of the antibody, or placebo. They received these via intravenous infusion that was given every 8 weeks over the course of about 2 years. So 10 IV infusion every other month for about 2 years. And in that time, they received HIV diagnostic testing on a monthly basis, a host of other HIV prevention interventions and options, including access to pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP, oral Truvada at the time, and a host of counseling and other procedures. Yes, Michael.
People wanted to know if transgender people included in the study were both male and female.
Yes. Trans individuals in the study had been assigned either male or female sex at birth. And there were, I use trans as a perhaps an appropriate shorthand. There were a range of, there was a range of language in which participants would characterize their gender identity. Yeah. All right, so we learned a lot from this study. I'm not going to go into the details here, except to just show you that we did learn that, yes, we proved that antibodies can bind to that envelope protein, and in so doing can neutralize the HIV, and that neutralization can prevent HIV. It prevents HIV in about 75% of the individuals who are exposed to viruses that are sensitive to that antibody. That means that that antibody is able to bind tightly enough, that there's enough antibody that can bind tightly enough and well enough to that spike, that purple tree-like protein, and neutralize HIV, preventing acquisition of infection. The problem was that the number of viruses that were sensitive to VRC01 was much lower than we had projected. Only about 30% of participants were exposed to viruses that were sensitive to, sufficiently sensitive, I should say, to that antibody. And that leads us to these bottom lines, which are reflect individuals that were exposed to viruses that were not sensitive enough to VRC01. And so the overall efficacy, the overall ability of this antibody to prevent acquisition of HIV in this study was not statistically significant, was low. So, however, this did beg the question of, okay, this is a unique population. We have individuals who've been getting monthly HIV diagnostic testing, so quite frequently over the course of 2 years. And when their HIV infection was identified, they were quickly linked by their study site to into HIV care. So early ART initiation in the course of their infection. They also were unique because at least many of them, those not in the placebo group, would have had this broadly neutralizing antibody circulating in their bloodstream at the time of acquisition of HIV. Each of those factors, the early ART initiation alone, as I showed you in the SPARTAC sub-study, and the presence of those broadly neutralizing antibodies, each of those factors might have a favorable, a beneficial effect on their immune system and might have a negative effect on the virus. We can talk about how that might work. But each of those things could help them, their immune system, fight the HIV, and could actually harm the HIV, basically make it less able to do as much harm in their body. So both of these things might be going on, and both of these things might set the stage for later ART-free virologic control. And this ART-free piece of that phrase can only be evaluated, of course, in an ATI, which brings us to the post-AMP ATI, where we were looking at these unique participants, and they're unique in many ways. They're unique in part because they joined the study that was going to have them get an IV infusion every other month for 2 years, and HIV diagnostic testing every month, and all of the other demands of the study. So they're unique in that way as well. But immunologically and virologically, they're unique because they had this early ART initiation and these broadly neutralizing antibodies at the time of their HIV exposures. So again, we're looking at this time point in an ATI here. And the red line here that reflects the viral load in the case of the study that we're looking at, that red line reflects the viruses that these individuals came across in the course of their participation in the AMP study. Any questions so far? Yes. Is there, oh no, is there a question? Yeah.
So what's the outcome in terms of the subtypes being sensitive to particular issues?
Yeah, so clade B subtypes were more likely to be sensitive. There were slightly more of them, but not that much actually. There was not a meaningful difference in the proportion of clade B versus clade C, for example, viruses that were sensitive to this antibody. And
is that linked to our number of infections? Because I thought that there was a difference between sensitive.
There is a slight difference in sensitivity, but there was a slight difference in the number of individuals who acquired HIV in each of the studies, but that was not thought to be related largely to the antibody itself. These antibodies that are being evaluated are by definition broadly neutralizing, so by definition they are capable of neutralizing across multiple clades.
And have the results been presented to placebo versus active?
No, they haven't yet, but that actually was just submitted to a journal last week. So we'll start looking at that. I'm going to refer you to that paper. There was not a noticeable difference in CD4 T cell count. I'll tell you that much. There were some differences in early viral load dynamics. Yeah, good question. All right, I am not going to go in depth in this slide, but I am happy to talk with you guys about it at some point later. It's actually one of my favorite things to talk about because here you get to see what happens when an antibody, let's imagine this is VRC01, binds to the virus here on one side of this image, or binds to a cell that's infected by the virus, forming this thing called an immune complex. And this immune complex is a powerhouse, or can be a powerhouse, at really recruiting the full potential of an individual's immune system, whether that individual is living with HIV or not living with HIV. That immune complex can interact with all of these other elements in the immune system over half a dozen different ways that it might essentially prime or prepare the immune system to respond more effectively in later during an ATI. So without getting into too much more detail about that, let me know if you have questions and we can explore it. All right, so another question that I really appreciated and enjoy kind of hearing some dialogue about with Liz's talk is the crucial role of stakeholder engagement, community engagement, and really engagement of all kinds of stakeholders in these studies. And particularly as we were moving into exploring an ATI in Africa, and as I'll tell you just briefly at the end, also in South America, this was really quite crucial. We started with, before we ever even had a protocol, with just the concept idea, we started meeting with individuals in Johannesburg and in Boston to talk about the idea itself and to hear questions and concerns and be prepared to engage in longer term dialogue about this. We've talked with investigators, people that had participated in the AMP studies, and people who were working in HIV treatment in each of these areas. We talked with ethicists, we talked with regulatory representatives, so national regulatory authorities, ethics committees, public health and community representatives. And we started to get a sense of what their questions and concerns and thoughts on design were. We then developed a protocol draft and brought those questions even more broadly to actually many of you through the Martin Delaney Collaboratories and IAS working groups for HIV cure. And these were largely conference calls that we were having, kind of outlining our ideas and hearing questions and concerns and recommendations and so forth, which we continued to integrate into a revised protocol that we went through the Division of AIDS with. And we also brought that revised protocol again back to Johannesburg and to meetings in DC to really talk about, again, design elements, engagement, implementation considerations, and so forth. Finally, as we were preparing to submit to regulatory authorities in throughout sub-Saharan Africa, we brought representatives of ethics committees from every site that would be conducting the study, representatives of national regulatory authorities in every country that would be conducting the study, public health representatives, primary HIV care providers at local clinics, public clinics in the regions where we were conducting the studies, and community representatives brought them all together to one final big long meeting in day-long meeting or 2-day-long meeting in Cape Town to say, this is what we've arrived at after this last year of consultation. Here is the final protocol idea that we've arrived at. Here's the final implementation plan that we've arrived at. Do you have any remaining questions or concerns? We also had, of course, PIs and study coordinators and community liaison officers from all of the sites where the study would be conducted in these consultations. This final consultation, I think in particular, was really crucial because about 2 or 3 weeks later, we submitted the protocol to all of these ethics committees and regulatory authorities. And the investigators at each of the sites conducting the study physically went to their ethics committee members, and we had laid the groundwork for really productive conversations and ongoing dialogue about kind of the site-specific considerations of implementing the study. And the regulatory process for these studies went as smoothly as, or more smoothly than any other study that I've submitted into regulatory authorities in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think in no small part because of this engagement. Now, the study was designed based on recommendations that, again, many of you in this room have co-authored or contributed to. And some of the select eligibility criteria I've listed here. These were for individuals who were former AMP participants only, who had initiated ART within at least 6 months of their HIV diagnosis and remained virologically suppressed on ART for at least a year. They had to be willing to be on effective contraception and use barrier protection throughout the trial. And they had to be generally healthy as defined by some of the characteristics listed here. The study design is probably one that's quite familiar to you. Participants were screened. They went through an RTI switch if need be. And then they went into the ATI, the first schedule of ATI, where they were fully virologically suppressed still and were being followed on a weekly basis for the first 2 months and then every other week. once they had 2 viral loads confirmed consecutively greater than 200, they went into another ATI schedule where they again reverted to weekly follow-up. If they had moved into the less frequent follow-up, they would go back to weekly follow-up until and unless they met ART restart criteria and moved into the final schedule 3, where they restarted ART and were followed for at least a year. The reinitiation criteria that we apply are listed here. I will say that all except for 1 participant who has restarted ART met the virologic criterion, which is not surprising. And that is that the viral load was greater than or equal to 1,000 copies for at least 4 consecutive weeks. And in that last week was not declining by half a log from the previous week. So it wasn't on a downward trajectory. So some specific study design considerations. We had a really robust informed consent process. And that began with an informed consent video that was made by many people, but including Michelle Andrasik and Gail Broder in the back of the room that you'll hear from in the next panel, where in that informed consent video, we explored some of the kind of basic principles of virologic and clinical trajectories on and off ART. We looked at a lot of questions that we thought participants, and a lot of these questions were driven by the stakeholder consultation that we did for the year or so prior to the study. So is it safe to stop HIV treatment in a study? What is this thing about a potential impact of early antibody presence, circulation during acquisition or early ART, and so forth? And then we outlined the specific requirements of participating in the study. This, of course, complemented the informed consent form and dialogue. It was all reviewed by the ethics committees. It was coupled with an assessment of understanding. And importantly, it also was coupled with facilitated decision-making process. So a decision aid that walked participants through, this was like a 4-page questionnaire that walked participants through systematically a thought process about, is this trial a good fit for me? Is it going to fit into my life? Does it align with my values and my preferences? What are the potential benefits or risks that are most important to me? And how does that all fall out in my kind of personal calculus of whether or not I should participate in a study like this? And it seems to have worked, because based on worked, meaning it seems to have ensured or helped ensure that participants that joined the study really did want to be there. It really was a fit for them. They really did know what they were getting into. And they demonstrated that understanding consistently over time, because we kind of periodically would do another decision assessment with them. What we did hear from sites were that it's not just one session. This screening process is involved. These, remember, were participants that the site already knew. They'd been doing this study for, they'd been doing the AMP study with them for years. And so they had a relationship with their site staff, and still it really was a multi-visit, multi-dialogue process to screen and decide whether to participate. And as we heard from site investigators, many of whom are primary HIV care providers as well in the treatment context, they described this as a whole nother level of respecting a participant's decision. We had one investigator, for example, who really did not initially want to do the study. They said, I cannot imagine telling any of my patients to go off of ART. And this is an investigator who is deeply committed to research and deeply committed to HIV prevention and treatment and cure. And it was through the process of watching and walking with participants who were going through this decision aid process, and through consultation with her CAB, that she understood, okay, this is something that we should explore, we should do. I'm going to be cautious about it, but I'm going to go for it. And she was just incredibly impressed with how authentic the informed consent and decision-making conversations were at the beginning of the study for each participant and throughout. We also did regular STI testing, and HIV transmission risk reduction counseling, and facilitated testing and PrEP access for partners was provided. All right, I think I'm running a little bit over time. My apologies, but I'll go through this as much as I can, as quickly as I can, to still get the information across. There were 52 potentially eligible participants for this study. I tend to think that one sign of a good informed consent is when a fair portion of people decline, because they really do know what they're getting into and they really are free to say, no, this is not for me. That is what we experienced here. But I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about why participants declined. You can see that here. One of the most common reasons that participants declined to participate in this study, remember these are women, largely of childbearing age, was because they were either pregnant or wanted to become pregnant or did not want to agree to the contraception requirements. A fair portion were also unable to be contacted. This study opened in February of 2020. Something else also happened in February of 2020, and it profoundly impacted this study. And this study and the brother study, if you will, in Peru were profoundly impacted by the COVID pandemic. People understandably had even more reservations about going off of their ART in the midst of the pandemic, and they were more mobile and more difficult to find and more difficult to contact. So we lost some people to follow up as well. People were relocating away from a clinical research site. And then you can see the remaining reasons here. However, again, I think another reflection of the informed consent process is that retention has been out of this world. There have literally been no visits missed. Over 300 visits conducted. On average, a participant has 20 to 25 visits so far in this study, and we've had 100% retention. There is one person who terminated early because they were relocating from the site, and you'll see that participant on one of the next slides. Yeah, this slide. So we're seeing a lot of different patterns of viral load in this study. Just briefly to orient you, on this slide, the viral load trajectory is reflected in red. The CD4 T cell count trajectory is reflected in blue. Each of these rectangles represents a different participant in the study. So you can see that, and the gray portion of it reflects when ART was reinitiated. You can see that every participant who reinitiated ART quickly resuppressed. There was no resistance identified at that time. And you can see that we have a few different patterns. I'm going to show you a couple of things here. That's the participant who terminated early. So they were still suppressed at the time that they had to terminate, but they were moving away from the clinical research site. So for safety reasons, they needed to reinitiate ART, and we did that. They did that. This participant, we do antiretroviral testing on dry blood spots or on plasma to see if someone who appears to be controlling their HIV off of ART actually isn't off of ART at all. And that was true in the case of this participant. That DVS was positive for antiretrovirals. Interestingly, we only discovered that because we only got the DVS test results back after they had already, quote unquote, reinitiated ART, because they had this, what turned out to be perhaps spurious or at least very brief dip in their CD4 T cell count, got concerned, told the site, I want to restart ART. The site said, no problem. The next, even before they had restarted ART, their CD4 T cell count had come back up. But again, then a few weeks later, we got data that actually that person had been on ART the whole time. And then finally, there's this participant here. At the time of this data, which was a couple of months ago, they had not met criteria to move into Schedule 2, so their viral load had remained below 200 counts. That is still the case. This participant is now over 18 months off ART with viral load suppression. And we have 2 additional participants that aren't reflected here who are now going into their 5th or 6th month of virologic suppression off of ART.
A question about that. Do we know that some people justify having a period of treatment, then can control afterwards? Do you know if these are post-treatment controllers like that, or what's? We
don't know. We know that that participant received VRC01, but we have not done anything. I mean, they may simply be a controller. We haven't done HLA typing. And I will say, although it's not reflected clearly here, we have such a small study. These are 13 individuals, but we aren't seeing any statistically significant difference in control, whether someone received VRC01 or placebo. We also are not powered for that effectively with 13 people, but we're not seeing it.
Right.
I think, yes.
Were all participants pre-screened for BNAP sensitivity prior to enrollment?
In the ATI, no, they were not. They were not. However, we do have that data and are including it in analysis because we have sequenced all of the viruses in the AMP study. So we know they're acquired isolate or isolates, or at least we know close to acquisition. You know, we don't know exactly if there's been some evolution there, but so we will be able to align that. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just wondering, is this do you know if this is a clade C or a clade B virus, the person who's still suppressed?
Yes, clade C.
I
Yeah.
just asked if it was a clade C or a clade B.
Okay, I was just asking.
Yes.
Yeah, no.
So this individual who's still suppressing had acquired a clade C isolate. Yeah. Yes.
So thanks. This is great presentation. Can you say a bit more about these screenings? Because it's, on the one hand, it's controversial because there are studies that people weren't screened. As I understand it, the tests themselves still being developed. They're not that comprehensive. Sometimes people who screen sensitive don't respond. Sometimes people who screen resistant.
Yes, so that's a great question. That's true. And actually, Steve may be the best person to answer this. I'm not sure, but so I'll invite you if you would like to weigh in. But in short, even in studies that are being done now, not done a few years ago based on acquired isolates in the parent study, there is, to my knowledge, no consensus that there is an effective way to screen for sensitivity, or no clear connection between the results of that screening and the outcomes observed in an ATI. Steve, do you want to add anything more to that?
No, I mean, there are a lot of problems with these assays. And I would agree with what you just said. But I would say that if you find resistance to these assays, it's real. Right? So they're good. So if you actually do these assays, you see a lot of phenotypic or genotypic resistance, you can basically do that. But if you don't see resistance, you don't really know it's not there. And often, you know, the amount of virus that's there to is so low that you can't actually find the studies. So we generally are not doing it.
So some people get sensitive, get responses to sensitivity.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
I have a question. Can you back to your regions? It looked like based on your, I just wanted to query you about the definition of your ATI conduct and actually be able to put that to test. Because in many situations, it looks like the individuals had multiple viral loads over 10,000 before they were reinitiated. Can you comment on that?
Yes, so participants were allowed to have a viral load greater than 1,000 or equal to 1,000 for up to 4 consecutive weeks. So you'll see that many participants did. That's the criterion that they met. The most common criterion for restarting that was met was that an individual had a viral load greater than or equal to 1,000 for 4 consecutive weeks. And in that last week, they didn't experience a drop of half a log or more. So the rationale behind that is related to that kind of involved slide about all of the potential immune-mediated mechanisms for control. And that's because you can kind of think about it as you think about a vaccine. You give a prime. So the prime in this case would be the first vaccination, the first exposure to the antigen that someone gets is when they're in the AMP study, the parent AMP study, and they acquire HIV. That gives them the virus that their immune system starts responding to, but we know that that immune response is generally too little too late, right? It's not keeping up with the virus early on, so they still get an established infection. But eventually then you give them ART, that virus comes down, so it's no longer visible to the greatest extent to their immune system. And then they go for a year like that. And then a year later, maybe you take them off ART, maybe the virus comes back up. It's almost like a boost in a vaccine prime boost situation where, again, that immune system now is reminded, oh, wait a minute, I know you and you are not good. And I'm going to do my best to rally my forces and control you again. That rallying the forces and controlling again, and then the virus kind of saying, nope, you missed me. And then the immune system going, yep, nope, I see you again. And I'm going to rally my forces again and bring it down. That creates these spikes, right?
I understand what you're talking about, because with any kind of immune therapy, you would expect that you have to have virus present in order for it to be reactivated. That's what you have to have if you suspect that there's going to be an immune response, and you really have to the immune system respond to the viremia in order to be able to have the viremia then ultimately reduced. But how often were these persons having their viral load checked?
Every week.
Every week, okay. So you get multiple over 1,000, but they weren't 4 weeks apart, you kept them off.
Oh, yeah. No, when they were in that schedule, they were being followed weekly for viral load testing.
Shelley, there's another question. People want to know if the post-treatment controllers were men or women.
In the study that's reflected here, these are all women in sub-Saharan Africa. I have not shown you any data from the sibling study that was conducted in Peru that is ongoing. The Peru study, also largely related to COVID, started quite a bit later than the study in Africa. It started last August. So we're still accruing data there.
Thank you.
Jeff.
Shelley, since you're doing testing only monthly in the parent study, these people weren't picked up like with Dale, the TIE studies and other studies. Like you can comment maybe on the time of audit initiation in that one long-term controller.
I cannot comment on it specifically in this individual. On average, it was 7 weeks from the first, including the retrospective testing of diagnosis. Yeah.
There was another question in the chat. There was do you think HLA or KIR typing should be done on all the study participants?
It will certainly be done on those that we're identifying as controllers. I don't know whether we will do that on others. But that's a good question. Yes.
Sorry, there's one in the corner of the bottom row, the VRCA one, it looks like their viral load is beginning to trend down and it's starting to get around the 1,200 copy mark. Is there a thought about if the ATI test, if the viral load were actually extended out to 2 or 4 weeks, that you actually may see people who are, you may see people who are actually dropping their viral load below that restart criteria, but because of the frequency, you're actually catching them, whether it means it's still in that prime boost.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we had so many conversations in the beginning about really how to balance participant safety and integrate all of these global recommendations around ATI trial design with our desire to not miss a potential, maybe late start to the immune response that would ultimately control. So the balance that we struck was, with 4 weeks of this, but it is possible that, and weekly testing, it is possible that if we tested less frequently, it's possible that if we allowed participants to go 6 weeks, instead of 4, that we might see more kind of later term, slightly later term immune mediated control. That's possible. We won't know because we, designed it this way based on all of those recommendations and input. But it's a good question, and I think it's a question that the field will need to continue to consider in designing these trials. How do you balance participant safety and your objectives and potential kind of rationale for how you think your intervention is going to work?
So another question in the chat was, will these informed consent videos be made available to us so we can see what they say?
Sure, they're on Vimeo. Gail will help with that.
Okay.
Amendments are password protected because they were only intended for study participants, but now that we're at a point of the study where that concern is passed, I don't see any reason why we can't lift the password protection and just make them available. I can tackle that back in the office on Tuesday.
Beautiful.
Thank you. That
There's
sounds
another question on the chat here. So can someone comment on what, if any, are the mental health support put in place for the ATI studies? And if cultural approaches are developed in regards to the mental health?
That's a great question. We actually did, with Michelle Andrasic and others' leadership, we did develop psychological assessments that are conducted at baseline and periodically throughout the trial. So we do have that data. We haven't analyzed it yet. And yes, those psychological assessments were developed with stakeholders from the regions where the study was conducted. Yes.
So related to that question, what happens if someone scores really bad? The results?
Yeah. The reason that we're doing those assessments is so that sites can have that kind of information and engage in whatever kind of counseling, referral, or next actions they might deem appropriate, which could include, for example, restarting ART. If that could be an indication for restarting ART, but we didn't prescribe that. What's that?
Fantastic, yes. So long as they
Yeah.
Shelley, if I could just add, that was actually a comment that came up in our consultations, that there be some sort of an assessment. The concern that was voiced by advocates in the community was that someone may be sort of looking for a reason to go off ART and may not be thinking through the decision to join the study with the idea that eventually you will restart, and wanting to ensure that people would have a successful resumption of ART whenever the time was appropriate. And so that definitely came out in the consultations, and then we built in the assessments to look at that.
So I know we're at time. I've left this summary up here, and I do want to end with just one thing. We are doing this in Peru. But this summary, I think, is important to hold in mind that among African women in particular, relationships, pregnancy, autonomy, all of these are issues that unfold uniquely in the dialogue with these African women. It's not like a cookie cutter, take your US trial and put it into Africa experience. And using all of these tools, the psychological assessments, decision aids, robust informed consent, and so forth, as well as explicitly non-punitive testing for STIs and antiretrovirals, can also ensure the safety and success of these studies. So just an enormous thanks to the folks that all contributed to this study, to the sites that contributed to this study, and to the participants in particular who contributed to this study. Thank you.
I'm not gonna run to you tonight. I'm just gonna make my way to the city of light.